Good evening and welcome to Bermuda's News and Views. I'm your host, Don Burgess, and with me tonight is Premier David Burt. Premier, hope you had a lovely holiday period.
Thank you very much, Don. The holiday was good, and I hope that you were well, and I certainly send you best wishes to your wife.
Thank you. That's much appreciated. We're going to talk about the pre-budget report. And what exactly is the pre-budget report?
Well, the pre-budget report was first done by the Bermuda government in 2011 in advance of the 2011 budget. And what the pre-budget report is, it's part of an open budget framework, which is to enhance budget transparency and to make sure that we're giving the public and stakeholders a better opportunity to comment on what the items that the government of Bermuda may be considering to put into the next budget. Most of the items in the pre-budget report are focused around the taxation policies, but there's also things that are in there about the spending considerations that must be considered for the next fiscal year. And the reason why a pre-budget report is important is because, before then, the budget was a secret until budget day, and then budget day would happen, things would be announced, and sometimes there might be some unintended consequences or certain items which may come out of budget day. And this is to make sure to avoid things like that, to avoid those levels of uncertainty, to ensure that there's adequate comment period, there's no surprises, people can understand what are the different things that the government of Bermuda is considering, and so that people can provide feedback on the proposals which have been laid out.
What stakeholders take part in forming the pre-budget report to make sure that's as best as possible before being released to the public?
Well, this year, as the government was considering changes to the various rates in payroll tax, we certainly did go out to relevant sectors, relevant business groups, whether it be the Chamber of Commerce, things that represent the international business sector, the trade unions, in advance to ask if they had any considerations or thoughts in advance of the publication of the pre-budget report. And some of those items are captured inside of the pre-budget report, where there are things about various tax concessions which may want to be considered and or offered. And so that was an important item. But typically, most of the consultation happens in a pre-budget report after the pre-budget report is published.
And now you're asking for the public to give feedback on this. What examples can you give us in the past where the public has made suggestions and the government has listened to the public and made those suggestions?
Well, I think that just about every single pre-budget report that has been issued, at least I can speak to in 2017, and this is just for information, the second full budget that I would be doing as Premier and Minister of Finance. So in 2017, at the election, there was a pre-budget report that was done in December of 2017 prior to the budget of February 2018. And an example where there are a number of various items that were proposed. There was feedback that was given, and those plans were adjusted. I don't believe there was a pre-budget report that was done last year, but I can look back to, I think, 2019 with the former Minister of Finance. There was a pre-budget report that was issued. There was the issue of rental tax. That was one of the things that was inside of that went out to public consultation. In the end, the government elected not to advance on that particular issue. And so I'm expecting that there will certainly be some modification changes. There's a lot of various options which were put forward in this pre-budget report, things that are recommendations from previous Tax Reform Commission recommendations that the government has not implemented to date, but they went out to public consultation to get feedback on, for instance, changes to international business fees, changes to outsourcing and withholding taxes, and we want the stakeholders of whom that will affect to certainly make their views and responses known, what the impact that it may or may not have on their businesses, any alternatives that they wish the government to consider, which may meet the objective that the government is trying to achieve, but may impact their business continuity and operations less. So, I mean, it is a truly consultative process, and it's something that helps with transparency, so people can get involved in the budget process, people can understand the budget process, and people can know exactly what are the driving factors behind the government's decisions when it's looking at putting forward the budget for the year. And budgets are really important, Don. Budgets are important because they're basically the statement of the government's intention for that year. A government can have a number of policy proposals and plans that it wants to execute over the time that between elections. But the budgets are basically a signal to say these are the things that the government is going to allocate funding to in this year in order to get complete. And of course, in any particular situation, you can't do everything in a year. So it's a give and take. But the most important thing is that we are adequately funding the government of Bermuda and we are progressing towards a balanced budget.
Well, along with that, I guess part of the thing is like unexpected surprises come up during the year that you weren't counting on. We can think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which affect the civil air register. But what other sort of things last year affected our budget, and what lessons, if any, that we learned from those?
Well, I mean, you can never plan. No one has a crystal ball, and certainly last year there were a number of impacts. I mean, the budget was delivered before Russia invaded Ukraine, and so the impact on the civil aviation authority certainly wasn't considered at the time that the budget numbers were finalized, and they were largely finalized before I took back over the role as Minister of Finance. I think also things that affected last year with the impact of the war in Ukraine is the massive spike that we saw in energy prices. And the government elected to put in place a fuel price stabilizer, which froze fuel at February levels. And in the freezing of the fuel at February levels, of course, that would have impacted some of the revenue that was coming to the government of Bermuda, because we did that by just reducing the taxation that was in the price of gasoline. Also, certainly, the economic relief package that was delivered, the additional funds that were put out to housing, as when the economy was experiencing significant growth, especially in the international business sector last year. And there were challenges when it came to housing. And one of the things that the government has not necessarily been able to put as much funds to as we would like to is for housing. So we did make special allowances to increase funds for housing. And then there was the issue of the change in regulations for firefighters and the real risk that our airport would be forced to not take incoming commercial flights. So then we had to go with a short-term solution, very uncomfortable, not something that the government liked or wanted to do, to bring in short-term overseas firefighters to ensure continuity of airport operations throughout the year. And then there's one final thing, of course, which is something that a lot of persons know and remember from past times, was the travel authorization fee. We had budgeted for the travel authorization fee to be in place throughout the entire budget period, but that did come to an end at the end of November. And so with the ending of the travel authorization, that also meant that the budgetary impacts, the amount of revenue that was expected, would have been less than would have been budgeted. So I think those are the main things that affected last year's budget, the current fiscal year, the one that we're in, our budget performance. And we did outline a number of those items in the pre-budget report.
No, I know a lot of people were disappointed it took us so long to get rid of the travel authorization. Were budget considerations part of why it lasted till November?
I think that certainly budget considerations were a part of it, but I also think that it was a question of whether or not the chief medical officer felt as though Bermuda still needs to be in a public health emergency and the impacts of which that would have. I know that persons did not like the fees and charges. But I think it's also important to note that the government spent in excess of $100 million in various aspects of the COVID relief program, whether or not that was the unemployment benefit, whether or not that was the funds that were given to small and medium-sized enterprises to make sure they could continue the continuity of their operations, whether that was the follow-on items with the supplementary unemployment benefit. There was a significant amount of spending, and all the money that had to be spent on the health infrastructure as well, whether it's the molecular diagnostic laboratory, whether it's all the various testing, the vaccination program, all those things. And with budgets for a country, just like budgets for a family, you must, make those difficult decisions. And so there's certainly a space where government revenue plays a part. But as the public health emergency came to an end in November, the chief medical officer determined that we no longer needed to be in a public health emergency. Those things came to a close. And that does not mean that there's not still COVID. Clearly there is, but we have to remember a public health emergency is a threat to public health, and public health is the healthcare system itself. And so we know what happens when the healthcare system gets overburdened. And we saw that in, I want to say, you'll call it maybe October of 2021, where we know that Bermuda was ravaged with the Delta variant. And the challenges of which certainly that had caused with the hospital having to go to a level 4 emergency, which means that, public health is affected because that means that persons can't get routine care, all those type of things. And so once there was no longer considered a threat to the public health system, that's what brought the end to the public health emergency, because even though we still have significant cases of the coronavirus still circulating in the country, there is not viewed that it would be a threat to the public health system, and the public health system would be able to manage through any spikes. So that's the reason for the conclusion of the public health emergency.
Now, you were talking about the budget. Is everything on play, or is there anything hard and fast that's not going to change regardless of the public feedback, or is everything can be tweaked a little bit?
The budgeting process is a very long process. I mean, it starts with government departments. Government departments begin the budget cycle in September of the previous year to go through the budget training, to start with looking over and reviewing their figures. But it kicks off in earnest around the time of November, where initial estimates are sent into the Ministry of Finance for those things to be reviewed and to be considered. Then there's matters that are considered in December, and then January, the ministers then meet to decide what the final budget figures will be. And so budget day is set for February 17th. It takes about 2 weeks to prepare the actual nice, big, thick budget books, which come out every year, because of course, all the numbers that are then decided have to go down to all the various ministries. All those things have to be filled in, and all those line items, so it can be presented to Parliament on budget day. So there's always tweaks that can be made, and tweaks are also made based upon current year budget performance. So for instance, if our budget performance is better than expected this year, that means that there is, and this is a technical term, fiscal space. That means that there's a little bit more space to possibly have additional spending next year. At the same point in time, if budget performance in the current year is less than it was expected, that means that some ways you have to go tighter in the following year. So it is fluid, certainly, but those figures have to be set in stone by the end of the month of January. So we continue the consultation. I mean, we have consultation with trade unions, we have consultation with the international business sector, the local business sector, and other interested parties that the officials in the Ministry of Finance are meeting with to make sure we gather all the feedback. So when the ministers debate these items over the next few weeks, we can come up with a budget that represents the needs, views, and priorities of the entirety of the country to ensure that Bermuda can continue on a path of economic recovery.
Now, you mentioned just now about how if depending on how this year's budget goes affects the next year budget. This last year, according to the projections the government's produced, it looks like we're on the good side about $40 million, $50 million. So how is that impacting this year's budget?
Um, well, that's so far this year. I mean, things can change, so we don't have the figures that have come in from December 2000 this year yet. So, of course, the government's fiscal year starts in April. And so the figures that were reported, I think, in the pre-budget report were for the half year. So that's up until September. Certainly, October, November, December will factor in, and you want to get at least 3/4 of the year done before you start making estimates for what the next year will be. So the Ministry of Finance informs me that those numbers will be able to start being reported next year. But what you are stating is correct, that there is some better budget performance than expected. And this is largely based to the better than expected tourism season that we had last year, despite all the commentary, certainly from the opposition, regarding the travel authorization. The fact is that the tourism season exceeded expectations, and that means that there was a significant additional revenue that did come to the government from tourism operations, as well as the travel authorization. Additionally, we have seen strength and growth in the international business sector, as was stated in the pre-budget report. The international business sector had its fastest growth in 15 years in 2021, and that growth has contributed to an increase in payroll tax collection, certainly, where quite a bit of that comes from international business, the recovery from local business, as as we move past the pandemic. And so from those items, there are some positive steps there, but also there are worries. With the increasing interest rate environment, families are being squeezed. With the inflationary pressures in which we're seeing around the globe, families and households are being squeezed. And all those things are the considerations that have to be taken into place. And certainly, the government is not immune to those inflation pressures. And so there's last year in the budget, we stated that public sector salaries would not increase until the budget was balanced. But as we announced in the pre-budget report, that's not a position that can be maintained when we see this inflation spike, which we have seen locally. Bermuda has not seen I would say, the level of inflation that other countries have seen, and that's on a percentage basis. Some of that is due to government policy, as I said, with the fuel price stabilizer that we had put in place, but also this because the percentage increase is not as big. We have to remember that Bermudian prices were far higher than they were in other places to begin with. So the dollar impact still has an impact on persons' pockets. So that is not a loss on the government of Bermuda, and that is the reason why we continue to look for ways to provide relief, and we continue to make sure that we are doing whatever we can to maintain purchasing power for the residents of this country, but specifically the working class who are most affected by the increasing costs of food.
Right. You have a couple initiatives in the budget to help the working class. One dealing with payroll tax, another with social insurance. Do you want to go ahead and explain what the government plans on doing?
Well, in the pre-budget report, we had laid out a revision to the payroll tax system, and not so much the payroll tax system as much as the payroll tax rates. One of the things that the government of Bermuda promised in its 2020 election manifesto was to eliminate payroll taxes for those making under $48,000 a year. And so this, of course, 30% of the workforce is making under $48,000 a year, and it will basically eliminate the payroll tax burden for those persons. And so that is the quote that is from the pre-budget report. I think it's also important that we note the historic reductions that the Progressive Labor Party has put in place for payroll taxes since 2017. So in the first budget, we did reduce payroll taxes for those persons in the lower band while putting increases in the higher bands. And I think it's important to note that the cumulative tax savings for someone who is making $48,000 a year over these periods in time has been $4,920. And that is the cumulative tax savings. So what we've done is follow through with our word to reduce the burden of taxation on those who make the least. And so the revision that we were proposing for the payroll tax changes are to eliminate the lowest band and to adjust the next few bands. But the impact of these and tax rates, it's not a complex system, I would say, but it's difficult to understand when people see the rates and see the rate changes. They say, oh, I'm in the $48,000 to $96,000 band. Why are you increasing my taxes? But the proposals of which the government has laid out is that anyone that is making $105,000 or less will pay less payroll taxes. And so it's a key point to note that before it was always 96,000, but we recognize as inflation bites and all the rest, we needed to try to make that threshold a little bit higher. But those are all matters which are subject to consultation. There's been some feedback that has come back to us to say that, okay, the bands are 0 to 48,000, 48 to 96,000, and then the next band is very big. It goes from 96,000 all the way up to 235,000. Will the government consider adding another band inside of there? So those are all things of which we're looking at, because we're mindful also that though they are the persons at the lowest end of the economic spectrum that are struggling, we also recognize that there are families, and recognizing the costs and expense of living in Bermuda. There may be homeowners who are impacted by increasing interest rates for mortgages that will have their income squeezed, and just because they might be making a little bit over $105,000 a year, the burden of increased taxation may also be a particular challenge for them. So those are all things in which we're looking at to try to make sure that we can come up with something that's fair and equitable that can meet the government's revenue needs. Because as I had stated in the budget statement last year, and as I've stated in the pre-budget report, one of the challenges that we have is that this year, of course, we have to make up for the travel authorization fee, which is not going to be in place. And so that's going to be approximately $25 million of revenue that is lost. In addition to that, there is the hole that needs to be filled with the money from the Bermuda Civil Aviation Authority. And also there are significant needs in the government of Bermuda and wider, whether it's funding for the Bermuda Hospitals Board to make sure they can continue to provide adequate service, whether it's an issue of capital funding. Persons want to speak about roads and other items, and the government's capital plans is aging. So there's difficulty in making sure that we can pave roads, to making sure we have a functioning asphalt plant. There's the issue with Tynes Bay, and there's also the issue which is central to our tourism, just clearing off of seaweed off of beaches. I know there were some complaints last year. The government equipment that did that was out of service, and this is just a result of a significant amount of underinvestment over a number of years in the government's capital plant, maintenance upgrades, and we see aging infrastructure. And the reason why it's important that you make provisions to invest in infrastructure is because if you do not make those investments, if you do not keep up with maintenance, what you find is you end up spending more and more money than you should on maintenance, and sometimes it becomes better to replace than it is just to go forward and to continue to maintain. I can give a perfect example. The vehicle which I was using, of course, we know the BMW has been working for a while, but we were using a Toyota Camry. That Toyota Camry was 21 years old. It broke down the other day. We took to Bermuda Motors, and the amount of which the cost to fix was $30,000. Now it doesn't make sense to, that was more than the government paid for it 20 years ago. So it doesn't make sense to upgrade. But that's the same thing of which we'll see with tractors that the government uses, trash trucks, other things like that. So there is also a need to make sure that we can invest in capital items so that we can continue to provide sound services to the government of Bermuda.
The second part of that question was social insurance, because there's some big proposed changes with as well.
Thank you. Well, social insurance will not any changes that are proposed for social insurance will not happen and be announced in the budget. So it's important to note there. Social insurance was promised in the throne speech, and we expect to have the changes and overall revisions to the government's pension plans to be done in the legislature in September. But what the view and plan on that is that Bermuda is one of the few jurisdictions in the world that still, with a government social insurance system, which is the base safety net for senior citizens, charges everyone the same amount. So no matter if you're making $40,000 as a cashier in Marketplace, or whether or not you're making $400,000 as the manager in Marketplace, you are paying the same amount of your income to social insurance. And so that means that the person who's, on the cashier is paying 3% of their income to social insurance, whereas the person who might be the chief executive is paying 0.3% of their income to social insurance. And that is not fair. That is not a fair system. Many countries used to be like this, where they had the same amount no matter what you made. Everyone paid the same fixed amount per month or per week. But we've seen just about every single country that had this system has moved away from that system. I mean, the United Kingdom moved away from that system about 40 years ago. Canada moved away from that system a long time ago. And for our perspective, it is not only a matter of fairness, but it is a matter to make sure that we can adequately fund our basic state pension, which is the social insurance system, into the future. Because we've heard, there's numerous reports that come in about the underfunding of the government pension system, and it's important that we make it stable into the future. So the changes which we are making are no different than what companies have in Canada, the US, the UK, all throughout Europe, all throughout the world. And it's something that is long overdue. It is something that was pledged and promised in the 2017 election manifesto. When I came back to the Ministry of Finance, it was not something that was done. And what I said was, this is going to be a priority for me because I think it's important that we do everything possible to boost the take-home pay of the working class.
Right. You mentioned the aging population. I know last year Bermuda's rising death rates and people getting older and declining birth rates. How is this having an effect on our budget?
I mean, that figure itself is certainly stark, but I don't believe that figure is out of step of what you'll see in many advanced economies, of which Bermuda is. I mean, we have declining birth rates, and these things are not unusual or unheard of, and there are things that people are grappling with around the world. But from a budget perspective, the approach of which I like to look at this from is the issue of how are we going to make sure that we adequately provide facilities for senior citizens, those to make sure that they can age well and to age comfortably. And one of the challenges that we see with our hospital, certainly, is that the number of beds that are being used by persons who are not in acute care or do not have acute needs, such as their long-term care, etc., those persons certainly take hospital beds away from the acute care needs. And that's some of the pressure which you will see in the hospital, and some of the stories of which we've heard recently about the difficulty about getting beds, schedules, and surgeries being pushed back and delayed because there's not acute care beds available. Now, not all of these are the so-called granny dumping, where persons, don't want to take their family member back home. Some of these are just because the home is not ready for the senior citizen to go back to, or someone who may be disabled, for instance. It may not always be seniors. It may be someone who may have had an accident, may be disabled, and the home might not be ready. So we have to think about how do we make sure that we provide facilities that cost less than the hospital to administer care, that could be a place in between, such as rehabilitation facilities and others, where someone doesn't need acute 24/7 monitoring from a hospital space, but does still need some level of care, access, and attention before they're able to transition at home. And if we can get that done, then we can free up more hospital beds. But of course, that requires capital investment from the government of Bermuda to go ahead and modify, upgrade, build facilities in order to accommodate those. So those are all the things that factor into the issue of certainly the aging population. And we have to make sure that we're making provision for that. What is also important to note is the very real truth that the Minister of Economy and Labor laid out when we speak about the age dependency ratio, because that's the ratio of younger working people that you need compared to older persons in the economy to ensure the economy can continue to sustain itself so that pensions can continue to be met from working persons. And so the government, of course, has taken a different approach to its budgeting, its approach to that matter, rather than the argument of, oh, we need more people, we need less people, oh, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. We've just following a purely data-driven approach. We've taken the OECD average for the old age dependency ratio to say that Bermuda wants to meet the OECD average. And in order to meet the OECD average, we need to expand the workforce by this much. And we will then target our policies to make sure that we can do that, to make sure that we have the amounts of persons that are working the economy, that are contributing in the economy, that can sustain the country's finances and the country's social safety net into the future.
Looking forward, government sort of projected that we'll have a balanced budget by 24-25. How is that looking? How are we going to make it to that point, and then possibly get to the point of knocking down some of our $3.1 billion in debt?
So, to answer the question, will we have a balanced budget in 2024-25? The answer is yes. And that is the reason why we've put forward the policies and proposals that have been laid out inside of the pre-budget report, because it's vital that we start on the path to making it to a balanced budget. And what was laid out in the budget statement as a feedback and response from the Fiscal Responsibility Panel is to make sure that the government has a coherent plan to get ourselves to a space by fiscal year 2026-27 that our budget surplus is $50 million. Now, there are some points to note in that. Number one, our better budget performance has meant that our debt has not increased as much as we thought it would have. That is a good thing, and we've performed reasonably well when compared to other countries when talking about the pandemic and our budget balances. The second thing that should be noted is that in the refinancing of our debt this year, gross debt actually did decrease as a result of that transaction. So that is something that is good. The third thing is that in the debt refinancing that we did last year, it meant that the government of Bermuda does not have to go back to the financial markets to refinance any outstanding debt until 2027. And it would be very difficult, or it would not be very difficult, it would be very expensive, given how high interest rates are currently, to go into the market right now to raise additional debt. So the amount of money that is in the sinking fund is the amount of money that has to carry us through the next few fiscal years until we get to budget balance, as we are not going out to the markets to gather any additional or to raise any additional debt. And so the reason why it's important to bring the budget into balance is to stop borrowing money, to make sure that the amount of money that's in the sinking fund can actually last to the time of where we make it to a budget balance, so the government of Bermuda doesn't have to borrow any more money. And I'm reasonably confident that we will not have to borrow any more funds as part of the regular budget cycle.
And now I know we agreed to 30 minutes. You might have asked you a few more questions before you go.
Oh, sure. I thought we had an hour. I didn't know there was only 30 minutes.
An hour. Okay, great. Then I got a lot more questions.
No problem. I was booked in for an hour, Don. You've just given me some wonderful and great news.
Okay. Interest rates, and we're talking about families and things. I know, like, I have a coworker, because the U.S. Fed kept rising their rates over there, sometimes 0.75 points at a time. the amount that they're paying for their mortgage has gone up greatly. What can the government do, um, dealing with banks, dealing with government assistance to help these people that are caught in this trap, who've now, they have the variable rate, so every time the Fed raises the rate, they see an increase themselves. And going forward, the Fed, it's still predicted that the Fed's going to be raising the rate at least another time in as we move towards 2023.
That's a difficult problem. And the challenge that Bermuda has is that we do not have a central bank. So we do not have the ability to set our own interest rates. We do not have a lender of last resort. And so that in itself presents a challenge. But I think there's a few things around this. The first thing is that we need to make sure that there is better banking competition in the country, something that the government has been speaking about. We have supported the acquisition of existing banks. We've supported the formation of new banks for better banking competition in the country. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it is important to note that not every single bank in the country has raised rates as much as others. So there's been some banks that have raised rates by maybe 3%. There's been others that have only gone up by 0.5%. All of them have gone up, but the rates have not all gone up as much as others. One of the things that we did last year in the House of Assembly was that we made sure that switching your mortgage from one bank to another would not incur any government charges or any government fees. But there may be things that we can look at to promote those changes and switchings and additional support that the governor of Bermuda can provide. Because it is my view that banking competition is the best way to ensure that consumers get the best rates. And so right now there is a very big difference between certain local banks and the core rate of which they have and the rates of which they charge. You'll note, and I think it might be an interesting report that Bernie's been wanting to do, to look at the local interest rate changes by banks and see which banks have gone up significantly and which banks have just gone up a little bit and made those particular adjustments. So that's the other thing. It's just about making sure that people have choice inside the market and can move their mortgage to a lower mortgage rate if and not have to pay any additional taxes to the government of Bermuda. But I also want to go back to a point at which I raised earlier, Don, and that is the reason and some of the feedback that has come through the pre-budget reports. And as I said, when you speak to someone, if you go anywhere else, you say, oh, I'm making, $125,000 a year. And then the person's like, oh, you're doing pretty well. But, when you take that on top of mortgage costs and these costs and all the rest, and those things are increasing. And that's why I said that persons in that bracket may not actually be able to afford a higher tax burden. And so these are the types of things and considerations of which we have to take into account as to how can we make sure that we do not at least increase that tax burden, or to find out how we can provide some relief.
You mentioned the new bank. A lot of people are excited about the possibility of Jewel opening its doors. Well, opening its doors virtually. When might we see that happen this year? I know there's been a lot of talk, but when is it going to be open for business?
Well, I don't have any recent updates from Jewel Bank. I can certainly try to get back if Burners wants to send a comment or even contact the company themselves. I know that they're continuing to work through a number of particular matters with the BNV. But the fact is that whether it's a Jewel Bank, whether it's the Bermuda Commercial Bank, and with the mortgage guarantee program of which we put in place, where we see people that are first-time homeowners, the second stage of that, once that is fully subscribed and out, there'll be persons that will be able to transfer their mortgages to that particular program as well. I think that those are all things that can factor into focus, to factor into assisting persons in Bermuda. But the most important thing certainly is banking competition, and to recognize that there are not all banks have reacted to the increasing interest rates in the United States in the same way and fashion. There's been some local banks that have increased their interest rate significantly, and there's been other local banks that have not increased their interest rate significantly. And the message I would have is to make sure to take a look, to shop around. We have removed the taxes, removed the barriers on switching of mortgages. Before, if you had a new mortgage, you would have to pay a new stamp duty fee, etc. All those things have been taken away, and it may be beneficial for someone to look at changing their mortgage to a bank that is not charging as high as interest rates as some of the local banks are.
Now, you mentioned earlier about our tourism numbers are up, and I know we're expecting a bumper cruise ship season coming up. But when can we see a return, which would obviously help the budget, to pre-220 numbers?
Well, you're not going to see a return to pre-220 numbers until we have a hotel open in Southampton. And those are the facts and those are the realities. It's a difficult pill to swallow. It's something that, of course, caused me much pain and chagrin. The original proposal, which came to the government of Bermuda in 2021, if we were able to have that agreed by the end of 2021, would have seen the hotel opening this year. But there's a number of things that went into that. We all know the history. The reason why I'm delivering the budget this year, delivered the budget statement last year. But on an airlift perspective, it is unlikely that we'll see a return to the volume of airlift that we saw until we actually have the capacity of hotels to cover those persons. So I think that we'll see a little bit of recovery in airlift this year, but insofar as overall visitor numbers on island, those things will not be a reality because visitors will not have a place to stay. If all of the hotels that we had were full at 100% occupancy throughout the year, they still wouldn't make up those numbers because the fact that the largest hotel is not there. But at the same points in time, we have to recognize that there is investment that is happening in the tourism space, whether or not it is the matters which are taking place at Cambridge Beaches, the investment that's gone there, the approval that has been received for the Aerial Sands project from planning and the commitment there, whether or not we see the matters which are taking place at Bermuda Beach. There's continued hotel investment, which is taking place, and tourism is going to be the biggest driver of growth and combined with international business in the recovery. And so from that perspective, we will not see a return to the amount of visitors until we have the investment which is necessary from the hotel space. And that's why the government is so determined to make sure that Bermuda is competitive for investors, because investors have a choice of where they're going to invest their funds. And if investors can get a better deal in another country, they're going to go there. And as important as tourism is for the local economy and certainly jobs and opportunity, it's incumbent upon the government to do everything that it can to ensure that we can have tourism investment in Bermuda in the exact same way that we want international business investment in Bermuda.
Now, you mentioned getting the airlift, and I had to experience this myself. No direct Boston flight. So, and the hotel I was staying at over December, at one point in time, there were about 30 Bermudians staying at the hotel going to Leahy. And I mean, there was a concern there, like on the way back home, you're taking care of somebody who's a loved one who's just had an operation and having to make a layover somewhere else to try to get back to Bermuda. It's a bit taxing on somebody who's not in the best shape at the moment.
No, absolutely. And I can accept it. But I think it's also important to accept that airlines as well have been challenged. They don't have the capacity of which they had before. So during the pandemic, they did lay off a number of pilots, and they are now getting back to their capacity. So I do believe that next year we'll see, or this year, we'll see a return of Boston flights directly. But I think that speaks also to a broader issue that not all of these things are solely determined on Bermuda, because at the same points in time that we've seen a decrease in airlift in some cases, we've seen an increase in airlift in other places. For instance, with British Airways, et cetera, making sure that they continue the air routes, and they actually put on additional flights where they could, because it was so strong, the travel to Bermuda, business travel, and other travel. So it's not all Bermuda's doing, because many jurisdictions suffer with that. But the biggest reason why we do not see an increase in airlift or ease in airlift is because the tourism capacity from hotel beds is just not there. But I do believe come this year, I think the Minister of Transport may have good news when it comes to Boston.
One last question on healthcare, then I'll let you have a chance to have a final word. Our change in healthcare system, when can we see that taking effect? I know we've been talking about it for 4 or 5 years. When can we actually see some change happening with that?
Well, I mean, there's change happening now. I mean, there's change throughout the healthcare system. I mean, there's a number of things which are happening when it comes from a health innovation perspective. I'd encourage Burt News to speak certainly to Dr. Weldon to see the items of which she's doing on the innovative side. I'd also encourage to speak to the clinic which is being set up, Daily Mail, which is doing prostate cancer screening and others for persons. Those things have been supported in some measure by the government of Bermuda, because what we have set up is a health innovation fund, which is administered by the Bermuda Health Council, that is looking for innovative ways to make sure and to fund and support non-government ways of delivering better and more effective and efficient healthcare. And the reason why it's important to find out how we can make sure we deliver better healthcare and support these initiatives is what you want to do is you want to get people early rather than late. And the key to that is early detection, early treatment, and making sure that people have access to healthcare. The path this year, the two things that were laid out insofar as the health reform journey this year were the examination of the regulation of copays, because in the instance of copays, what happens is if someone does not have the disposable income to pay for their copay, they may delay their treatment. And if they delay their treatment, that means that they may be more expensive treatment later in time. And so what we want to make sure is that we provide access to that. The other thing in which the government is doing is to combine the administration of all of the government health insurance programs, such as the hospital insurance program, or HIP, as it's called, Future Care, and also the government employees health insurance program as well, GHI. So there's a lot of work that's going on there, but I would certainly encourage, I'm not the expert on what's taking place with healthcare reform. I would certainly encourage an interview with the Minister of Health and the health team so they can discuss all the things which are taking place over there, because there is significant work and effort. We would have wanted to get these things done sooner, but we know the Ministry of Health has been fully engaged in another matter. But that matter and public health emergency is over, and they are now all guns blazing on advancing issues related to health care reform. And it's not just the way we finance healthcare, it is also the way in which we deliver healthcare. Because if we do not get more efficient in the delivery of healthcare, then that means that over time, our healthcare expenses will continue to increase.
Yeah, I want to give you a chance to say something about the pre-budget that maybe I haven't asked you that you feel is important for the public to know.
Well, there's a few things. The first thing is that the pre-budget report was scheduled to have its feedback close on this tomorrow, actually, February 13th. That deadline has been extended to Tuesday, January 17th, not February 17th, of course, January 17th. And the feedback can be given via email at openbudget.gov.bm, but also on the screen, you can go to forum.gov.bm, look at the pre-budget report, add your comments, add your thoughts, offer your feedback on the pre-budget report. It's important that it's not a very long read. There's a lot of historical information that's in there. The main changes which are proposed are only about 5 or 6 pages inside of it, but it at least provides a perspective over the things that the government of Bermuda is considering this year. And it is a very important part of the budget process for making sure that persons are aware of what the government is considering, putting in place in the next budget cycle, and to have their say on how those proposals may affect you and your family and your business and or your industry. So from that, it's important that people do take a read, and then stay tuned for Budget Day, February 17th.
All right. Thank you, Premier. I appreciate having you on tonight.
Thank you very much, Don. It was a pleasure. Thank you to Burt News for providing stellar service to the people of Bermuda, keeping the country updated and making sure that they get the information which they require. And again, best wishes to you and to your wife, Don.
All right. Thank you. That's much appreciated. I've been your host this evening, Don Burgess. Our guest was Premier David Burt. And on behalf of all of us here at Burt News, we wish you a very beautiful evening.